Unhappy is he to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. Wretched is he who looks back upon lone hours in vast dismal chambers with brown hangings and maddening rows of antique books, or upon awed watches in twilight groves of grotesque, gigantic vine-encumbered trees that silently wave twisted branches far aloft. Such a lot that God gives me, the dazed, the disappointed, the barren, the broken. And yet I am strangely content and cling desperately to those sere memories when my mind momentarily threatens to reach beyond to the other. I know not where I was born, save that the castle was infinitely old and infinitely horrible, full of dark passages with high ceilings where the eye could find only cobwebs and shadows. The stones in the corridors seemed always hideously damp, and there was an accursed smell as of piled up corpses of dead generations. It was never light. So sometimes I would light candles and gaze at them for relief. Nor was there any sun outdoors, since the terrible trees grew high above the topmost accessible tower. Now, there was one black tower which reached above the trees into the unknown outer sky, but that was partly ruined and could not be ascended save by a well-nigh impossible climb up the sheer wall, stone by stone. I must have lived years in this place, but I cannot measure the time. And beings must have cared for my needs, yet I cannot recall any person except myself, or indeed anything alive, save the rats and bats and spiders. I think that whoever did nurse me must have been shockingly aged, since my first conception of a living person was that of something mockingly like myself, and yet distorted, shriveled, decaying like the castle. To me, there was nothing grotesque in the bones and skeletons that strewed some of the stone crypts deep down among the foundations. I associated these things with everyday events, and I thought them more natural than the coloured pictures of living beings which I found in the many mouldy volumes. Now, from those books, I learned all that I know. No teacher urged or guided me, and I do not recall hearing any human voice in all those years, not even my own. For although I had read of speech, I'd never thought to try to speak aloud. My appearance was a matter equally unthought of, for there were no mirrors in the castle, and I merely regarded myself by instinct as akin to those youthful figures I saw drawn and painted in the books. I felt conscious of youth because I remembered so little. Outside, across the putrid moat, and under the dark mute trees, I'd often lie and dream for hours about what I read in those books. I'd longingly picture myself among gay crowds in the sunny world beyond, that endless forest. I mean, once I did try to escape from the forest, but as I went further from the castle, the shade grew denser and the air more filled with brooding fear, so that I ran frantically back, lest I lose my way in a labyrinth of nighted silence. And so, through endless twilights, I dreamed and I waited, although I knew not what I waited for. And then, in the shadowy solitude, My longing for light grew so frantic that I could rest no more, and I lifted entreating hands to the black, ruined tower that reached into the unknown outer sky. And at last I resolved that I would scale that tower, fall though I might, since it were better to glimpse the sky and perish than to live without ever beholding day. In the dank twilight, I climbed the worn and aged stone stairs until I reached the level where they ceased, and thereafter I clung perilously to small footholds leading upwards. Terrible was that stairless cylinder of rock, black, ruined and sinister, with bats whose wings made no noise. But more terrible still was the slowness of my progress, for climb as I might, the darkness overhead grew no thinner, and a new chill, as of mould, assailed me. I shivered as I wondered why I did not reach the light. I fancied that night must have come upon me, and I vainly groped for a window embrasure that I might peer out and try to judge the height that I had attained. And then, after an infinity of sightless crawling up that desperate precipice, all at once I felt my head touch a solid thing, and I knew that I must have gained the roof, or at least some kind of floor above me. In the darkness, I raised my free hand and tested the barrier, finding it stone and immovable. And then came a deadly circuit of the tower, clinging to whatever holds the slimy wall could give, until finally my testing hand found the barrier yielding. And I turned upward again, pushing the slab with my head, and I used both hands in my fearful ascent. There was no light revealed above, but as my hands went higher, I knew that my climb was for the nonce ended, since the slab was the trapdoor or aperture leading to a level stone surface of greater circumference than the lower tower, no doubt the floor of some lofty and capacious observation chamber. I crawled through, and I failed to prevent the heavy slab from falling back. As I lay exhausted on the stone floor, I heard the eerie echoes of its fall. Believing that I was now far above the accursed branches of the wood, I dragged myself up from the floor and fumbled about for windows that I might look for the first time upon the moon and the stars of which I had read. But on every hand I was disappointed, since all that I found were vast shelves of marble, bearing odious oblong boxes. More and more I wondered what hoary secrets might abide in this high apartment, so many eons cut off from the castle below. And then, unexpectedly, my hands came upon a doorway where hung a portal of stone. Now, it was locked, but with a supreme burst of strength, I dragged it open. And as I did so, the purest ecstasy that ever came over me was felt. For shining tranquilly through the ornate grating of iron and down a short stone passageway of steps that ascended from this newly found doorway was the moon, the radiant moon, which I'd never before seen save in my dreams or in vague visions that I dared not call memories. Fancying now that I'd attained the very pinnacle of the castle, I rushed up the steps beyond the door. But the sudden veiling of the moon by a cloud caused me to stumble, and I felt my way more slowly now in the dark. It was still very dark when I reached the grating, which I found unlocked, but which I did not open for fear of falling from the amazing height to which I had climbed. And then the moon came out again. No! Oh! Nothing that I had undergone before could compare in terror with what I now saw, or with the bizarre marvels that sight implied. I mean, the sight itself was simple, for it was merely this. Instead of a dizzying prospect of treetops seen from on high, there stretched around me on a level through the grating nothing less than solid ground, decked with marble slabs and columns and overshadowed by an ancient church whose ruined spire gleamed spectrally in the moonlight. Half unconscious, I opened the grating and staggered out upon the white gravel path which stretched away in two directions. My mind, stunned and chaotic as it was, still held the frantic craving for light, and not even the fantastic wonder which had happened could stay my course. I neither knew nor cared whether my experience was insanity, dreaming, or magic, but I was determined to gaze on brilliance and gaiety at any cost. I knew not who I was, or what I was, or what my surroundings might be, although as I continued to stumble along, I became conscious of a kind of fearsome latent memory that made my progress not wholly fortuitous. I passed under an arch, out of that region of slabs and columns, and I wandered now through open country, sometimes following the visible road, but sometimes leaving it to tread across meadows where only occasional ruins bespoke the presence of a forgotten path. Once I swam across a swift river where crumbling mossy masonry told of a bridge long vanished. Over 2 hours must have passed before I reached what seemed to be my goal. An ancient ivied castle in a thickly wooded park, familiar and yet full of strangeness. I saw that the moat was filled in, which it shouldn't have been, and that some once well-known towers were demolished, whilst unfamiliar new wings had been added. But what I observed with chief interest and delight were the open windows, gorgeously ablaze with light and sending forth the sound of the gayest revelry. Advancing to one of these, I looked in, and I saw an oddly dressed company indeed, making merry and speaking brightly to one another. I had never seemingly heard human speech before, and I could only guess vaguely what was being said. Some of the faces seemed to hold expressions that brought up remote recollections, but others were utterly alien. I stepped through the low window into the brightly lit room, passing, as I did so, from my single bright moment of hope to my blackest convulsion of despair and realization. The nightmare came abruptly, because as I entered the room, there occurred one of the most terrifying demonstrations I've ever conceived. Scarcely had I crossed the sill when there descended upon the whole company a sudden fear of hideous intensity, a dread which distorted every face and evoked the most ghastly shrieks from every throat. Flight was universal, and in the clamour and panic, several people swooned and were dragged away by madly fleeing companions. Many covered their eyes with their hands, and overturning furniture and stumbling against the walls as they ran. The cries from their throats were shocking, and as I stood alone and dazed, listening to their vanishing echoes, I trembled at the thought of what might be lurking near me, yet unseen. At a casual inspection, the room seemed deserted, but when I moved towards one of the alcoves, I thought that I detected a presence, a hint of motion beyond the golden arched doorway leading to another similar room. As I approached this arch, I began to perceive this horror more clearly. And then, with the first and last sound that I ever uttered, a ghastly ululation that sickened me almost as violently as its cause, I beheld in full, frightful vividness the inconceivable, indescribable, noxious monstrosity which had, by its simple appearance, changed a merry company to a herd of delirious fugitives. I cannot even hint at what it was like, for it was a compound of all that is unclean, uncanny, unwelcome, abnormal. It was the ghoulish shade of decay, antiquity, and desolation. It is the putrid, dripping eidolon of unwholesome revelation, the awful bearing of that which the merciful earth should never show, should always hide. God knows it was not of this world, and yet I saw in its eaten away and bone-revealing outlines a leering, abhorrent travesty of the human shape. I was almost paralyzed, but not too much so to make a feeble attempt towards flight. A backward stumble which failed to break the spell in which this nameless, voiceless monster held me. My eyes, bewitched by the loathsome glassy orbs which stared into them, refused to close, although they were mercifully blurred, and they showed the terrible object but indistinctly after the first shock. I tried to raise my hand to shut out the sight, and yet so stunned were my nerves that my arm would not obey my will. The attempt, however, was enough to disturb my balance, so that I had to stagger forward several steps to avoid falling. And as I did so, I became suddenly aware of the nearness of this carrion thing, whose hideous hollow breathing I now fancied that I could hear. Nearly mad, I found myself able yet to throw out a hand to ward off the fetid apparition, when, in one cataclysmic second of cosmic nightmarish and hellish accident, my fingers touched the rotting outstretched paw of the monster beneath the golden arch. I did not shriek, but all the fiendish ghouls that ride the night wind shrieked for me, as in that same second there crashed down upon my mind a single and fleeting avalanche of soul-annihilating memory. I knew in that second all that had been. I remembered the frightful castle and the trees, and I recognized the altered edifice in which I now stood. I recognized, most terrible of all, the unholy abomination that stood leering before me as I withdrew my sullied fingers from its own. But in the cosmos, there is balm as well as bitterness. And that balm is nepenthe. In the supreme horror of that second, I forgot what had horrified me. and the burst of black memory vanished in a chaos of echoing images. In a dream, I fled from that accursed pile and ran silently in the moonlight. When I returned to the churchyard place of marble and went down the steps, I found the stone trapdoor immovable, but I was not sorry, for I'd hated the antique castle, hated the trees. So now I ride with the mocking and friendly ghouls on the night wind, and play by day amongst the catacombs of Nephren Ka in the sealed and unknown valley of Hadoth by the Nile. I know that light is not for me, save that of the moon over the rock tombs of Neb, nor any gaiety, save the unnamed feasts of Nitocris beneath the Great Pyramid. Yet in my new wildness and freedom, I almost welcome the bitterness of alienage. For although Nepenthe has calmed me, I know always that I am an outsider, a stranger in this century, and among those who are still men. This I have known ever since I stretched out my fingers to the abomination within that great gilded frame. I stretched out my fingers and I touched a cold and unyielding surface of polished glass.